The bobbin is a clear plastic disc that typically does not come with thread, and so we put thread on the bobbin to match the thread that we're going to be sewing with. And so I have a spool of thread and I will be filling the bobbin. Now on this particular machine, the spool pins are in behind, and there are 2 of them. I'm just going to use one of them. Note about your thread. Most threads have some kind of a mechanism to secure the thread so it doesn't unwind. This one, it's this kind of rough area on the bottom. This should be on the bottom or sideways if your machine has a sideways spool pin, so that these are out of the way and the thread doesn't get caught in them when you're sewing or winding the bobbin. So I'm going to put that on the bottom. Now I do have spool caps. I'm going to use it. I wouldn't have to on this machine, but I do use them. The flat side always goes towards the spool. And then this machine has a thread stand, which would not be typical on a smaller model of a machine, but this is a professional model. So you just run your thread into that stand, and then there's a thread guide right here. Thread goes into that, and then you go straight across, and over here we have the bobbin winder tension. It looks a bit like a screw on the top of the machine, and on this machine you go around behind it and then in front of it, and you pull the thread right between there. There's kind of a gap that the thread gets pulled into, and you can feel that it puts a bit of tension on the thread. If you forget to do this, the thread will be too loose on the bobbin and it won't sew properly. So you want to make sure you don't forget that. Now, some bobbins or instructions will tell you to wind the thread around the bobbin. I find when I do that, sometimes the thread pulls off when I start to wind it. So I prefer to use the hole, and most bobbins have a hole, at least one. Some of them have several. And when you use the hole, you want to thread from the inside of the bobbin to the outside. That's very important. If you do it the other way, you can end up winding thread on the post, and then you have a mess to clean up. So inside to outside, and then you just push the bobbin onto the post, and the thread should be coming off the hole on the top of the bobbin, not underneath. If it's underneath, you'll end up winding thread onto the post. Then on this machine, you push over this part of the machine right here, and what that does is engage the bobbin winding mechanism. Now, I actually haven't turned my machine on yet. You need to do that when you're winding a bobbin. And then this one actually on the computer screen tells me to push the key. And so because there's a separate motor, I don't need to use my foot pedal. There's a button here with a picture of a bobbin, and I just press that button and it will start to wind. Once it's wound a little bit, I like to cut this thread off. You don't want any threads hanging out of that hole, because that can cause your machine to jam up. It gets caught when you start sewing. And then once you've trimmed that thread, you can carry on and finish filling your bobbin. Now, I'm not going to fill the whole thing today, but if I did fill the entire bobbin, this part, this mechanism would automatically disengage, and then your thread is all ready for threading the machine. I'm using a different color thread to thread the top of the machine so that when I have it all threaded, it's easy for you to tell the difference between the top thread and the bobbin. And this one has a little different mechanism on it, but it still has a slot to put the thread into, so that I'm going to put on the bottom. Now again, normally if I use the same thread that I filled the bobbin, you could just leave it on the spool pin. And again, I'm going to put my cap on the thread. And the thread goes into the stand, same as winding the bobbin, and into the thread guide. Then as we come across, now the bobbin winder tension is only used for winding the bobbin. I'm not going to use this. But this is attached to a piece that is a thread guide. And so you slide your thread into the back of that. I can actually hear a little tick when the thread is in position in that part of the machine. And then right here is another thread guide. And these thread guides are there to keep the thread moving in the right direction, and so it doesn't get tangled while you're sewing. And right in front of it is a slot, and I'm going to go straight down this slot. Now, if my machine didn't have the dial that it has, and I'm going to do a close-up of that area in a minute, then this slot here would have the tension for the thread in this slot. And when you're threading through there, it is very important that your presser foot is up, because if the presser foot is down, the tension discs are closed and the thread may not go into them correctly. So you always thread your machine with your presser foot up. And now I'm going to go into the tension on this machine, and I'll give you a closer view of what's happening with that. And so I just brought my thread down the slot that was in front of the thread guide, and then I go underneath the tension towards the back here. And there's a little wire here. I need to pull my thread up and pull on that wire so that the thread catches in a little hook that's in there as well. So then this thread is now going to go up this slot right here. And the take-up is in this slot, and I'm looking for it, but I can't see it. If you can't see it, it means you need to turn your hand wheel towards yourself until you can see the take-up in the top of this slot. And mine doesn't come out very far, but I can see that it's up there. And you go behind the take-up to the left, and then you pull your thread up and forward so that it comes right into the front of the take-up. If it just kind of slips around the back and stays there, it might come off, and then you come straight down this slot again. And then there's a thread guide right here, and you just slide your thread into that. There's another thread guide at the top of the needle, and you just slide the thread into that. And then the challenging part, you need to thread the needle. You need to thread the needle front to back, and I don't recommend taking it out to do this. I quite often will put my finger behind it because I can see the hole more clearly when I do that. And by the way, when you do this, make sure your foot is nowhere near the foot pedal. And needle's threaded. And then there's a little groove in the front of the presser foot, and I usually slide my thread through that groove and back behind so it's out of the way. This machine has what is called a drop-in bobbin. This is the throat plate, and the bobbin area has a cover on it. This is how you open it. There's a little button here, and you push it to the side, and this will just snap off. And so what we have here is the bobbin case that will hold the bobbin. So you take your bobbin, and it's important that you put it in the right way. So if you look at your bobbin, the thread's coming around here. And if you imagine this as a letter G, that is not the way you want to put it into the bobbin case. You want it to be a letter P. So very important that the thread's coming around to the left over the top of the bobbin, letter P. And then you're going to take your bobbin and put it into the case. And it just drops in. Now, you've learned about a tension for winding the bobbin and a tension that's on the top of the machine when you're threading. There is also a tension in the bobbin area. So if you look at the bobbin case, there's this little silver piece at the front of it, and almost right at the center front, there's a little kind of indentation. And that is where the tension is. So you want to slide your thread in that little dent and then you pull it over to the left, and you can feel the tension on the thread as you pull it, and you can see how the bobbin is spinning. Sometimes I will put my finger on the bobbin so it doesn't spin while I'm doing that. Now, we're not quite done. We want this thread to come up underneath the presser foot through the hole that's just underneath the needle that's in between the feed dogs on the machine. On this machine, there are two ways to do that. So this way of getting the bobbin thread is the same no matter what sewing machine you're using. First, you need to hold the thread that's coming out of the needle. If you don't hold this thread, it will basically disappear in the bobbin case, and you can use your scissors to pull it back up, but then you have to do it again. So I'm holding my needle thread, and then I'm going to turn the hand wheel towards myself. You can see the needle going down. Now the needle's coming up, and I'm watching the thread take up. When it's at the top position, I'm going to pull on the needle thread. And you can take your scissors, and there's a loop of blue thread there. That is the bobbin thread, and I'm just going to pull that through. And then my machine is ready to sew. But I'm going to show you the other way of pulling up the bobbin thread here. So the second way, and again, not all machines have this, but this particular machine has this button right here with triangles on it. If you push that button, it moves the needle. So I can push, oops, need to turn the machine on. So I can push this button once and the needle will go down. If I push it a second time, the needle comes up, and basically it's done the same thing as turning the hand wheel did, with just 2 pushes of that button. Then you can cover this up and you're ready to sew.